Have you ever found yourself in a room full of family, surrounded by the familiar clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation, yet feeling utterly alone? It's a strange sort of quiet, isn't it? The kind that settles in your bones even when there's laughter all around you. That was where my story truly began, at a Sunday dinner that felt just like any other, until it wasn't. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and the polite, practiced joy that so often filled these gatherings. I was seated at my usual spot near the end of the table, a place that had become my comfortable perch for observing, for listening, for being present but not entirely seen. My plate was a landscape of half-eaten food and unspoken thoughts. I'd nod and smile, a quiet participant in a play I'd been acting in for years. It was Iris, my daughter-in-law, whose voice sliced through the gentle murmur. She had a way about her, a polished confidence that could be both dazzling and sharp. "So, Lenor," she began, her voice smooth as the wine she swirled in her glass, "how does it feel being useless?" The word hung in the air, a deliberate, cruel ornament. She smiled then, a wide, bright smile that sought and found its intended audience. My son Caden let out a low chuckle. His sister-in-law gave a startled little laugh before her eyes darted guiltily toward me. Even my grandson, a boy I'd bounced on my knee, offered a fleeting smirk before looking away. For a long moment, I said nothing. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the room fading into a distant buzz. I carefully placed my water glass back on the table, my hand steady, a small island of calm in a sudden storm. I looked at Iris, truly looked at her perhaps for the first time that day. She wore a pair of expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a tiara, and a linen blouse I recognized. I'd paid for it, of course, a silent gift she'd accepted as her due. Her face was a mask of practiced charm, her confidence a fortress. I straightened my spine, a small, internal shift that no one else would have noticed, and when I spoke, my voice was quiet, almost a whisper in the sudden hush. "How does it feel?" I repeated her question, letting it settle between us. Then, with a calm I didn't know I possessed, I added, "Knowing this useless one won't be paying your bills anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been vacuumed from the room. Iris's perfect smile faltered, her eyes blinking in disbelief. Caden's fork, laden with mashed potatoes, froze halfway to his mouth. This time no one laughed. My words, though spoken softly, had the weight of years behind them. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was loud enough. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the hardwood floor, a final, definitive note. I took my purse from the back of the chair, gave a single encompassing nod to the stunned faces around the table, and walked through the patio doors into the afternoon sun. As I stepped outside, the light felt like a warm embrace, a welcome from an old friend. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I breathed out a long, slow exhale of burdens I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Behind me, the family I had held together for so long was suspended in a moment of stunned silence. But for me, something had finally, irrevocably unlocked, and I knew exactly where I was going. My quiet house, my little office, and a locked drawer that held the story of my silence were all waiting for me. It's funny how the biggest changes in our lives often start with the smallest of things, isn't it? For me, it began with a late mortgage payment. I remember the phone call as if it were yesterday. Caden's voice was low, laced with an embarrassment that was almost palpable through the receiver. Iris had overspent again. The little boutique she was so proud of wasn't doing as well as they had hoped. They were falling behind, and the bank was starting to send those letters, the kind with the bold, urgent print that makes your heart sink. Without a moment's hesitation, I wired them the money that very night, $4,200. I didn't ask any questions, and I certainly didn't pass any judgment. In my heart, I was just helping them catch their breath. We all stumble sometimes, don't we? We all need a little grace. They never mentioned it again. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of the weight I had lifted from their shoulders. But a month later, there was something else. The rent on the boutique space had gone up. Then, it was a credit card bill that Iris had, in her words, completely forgotten about, while planning a lavish birthday party for a friend. Then came the deposit for my grandson's private school, a sum that was, of course, due immediately. Each request was delivered with a quiet urgency, a silent expectation that I would, as always, make it right. I started keeping a record. At first, it was just a habit, the accountant in me finding comfort in order and numbers. I opened a spreadsheet on my computer, hidden away in a password-protected folder. I logged the dates, the amounts, and the reasons they gave. I even made a column for the receipts I'd requested but never received. The total grew at a pace that surprised even me. I never showed it to them, and they never asked. Dependable had become my unspoken title, not Mother or Lenor, but the one who quietly kept everything from falling apart. In the beginning, I told myself it was love. Then I reasoned it was my duty as a mother. But after a while, I stopped trying to name it at all. It just was. I remember one evening, about a year into this new arrangement, Iris kissed my cheek after a lovely dinner I had paid for. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she'd whispered. Her words meant not as a compliment, but as a quiet, chilling reminder of my role. It was after that night that I started printing everything out. The bank statements, the wire transfer confirmations, every piece of paper that told the story of my silent contributions. Now, standing in the comforting quiet of my own home, I walked into my office. The bottom drawer of my filing cabinet opened with a familiar groan, and I pulled out the folder. The papers inside felt heavy, not just with their physical weight, but with the weight of all the things left unsaid. For years, I had dreamed of a small cabin near Lake Lure. I used to drive by it on weekends, a charming little place with white shutters and a screened-in porch, nestled among a grove of pine trees. It wasn't anything grand, just a little slice of peace, a place where I could wake up to the sound of birds and sip my coffee by the water. I had been saving for it for nearly 5 years, my own secret dream tucked away like a pressed flower in a book. The down payment was almost ready when Iris called with what she called a vision. The boutique, she explained, could expand if I helped. She used words like legacy and family investment, words that were designed to tug at a mother's heartstrings. Caden chimed in, his voice full of a hope that I had funded. "We're so close, Mom," he'd said. "This could really change things for us." It was presented as an opportunity I couldn't possibly refuse. So I did what I always did. I cashed out my cabin fund, co-signed the loan, and watched as they added my name to yet another document, my signature a testament to a dream I was once again deferring. They never asked what I was giving up. I never told them. A year later, an invitation arrived for a painting retreat in Taos. 3 weeks of sunshine, oil paints, and quiet contemplation. My heart leaped at the thought. I almost said yes. But then, Caden happened to mention how much braces were costing for my grandson, and how their insurance was covering so little of it. I didn't even wait for them to ask. I just made the transfer. The brochure for the retreat stayed on my refrigerator for months, its sunny promises slowly curling at the edges, until one day I quietly took it down and threw it away. No one ever noticed it was gone. I don't know when the occasional sacrifices became the rhythm of my life. The lines blurred, and I became the cushion, the safety net, the one who was always there to break their fall. They built their lives on the foundation I provided, and they never once thought to look down and see who was holding them up. As I flipped through the documents in the folder, the boutique's receipts, a decade's worth of tuition payments, the loan agreements with my name written in neat, clear ink, a profound sadness washed over me. I had dreams once, bright and vibrant dreams of my own, and one by one I had traded them for theirs. Iris never saw the cost of her ambitions, but I did, and in the quiet of my office, holding the proof of my silent sacrifices, I knew, with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and liberating, that I was done paying. The final request came, as they so often did, just after dessert. The dinner plates were still warm on the table, and the rest of the family was drifting out onto the patio, their glasses of wine catching the golden light of the setting sun. Iris lingered behind, giving me a subtle nod toward the kitchen. I knew that look. It was the one she always wore just before she was about to ask for something, a practiced politeness that was her prelude to a transaction. She leaned against the granite countertop, her arms crossed, the diamond on her finger flashing in the dim light. "I wanted to talk to you about something exciting," she began, her voice light and airy. "The boutique is doing so well. There's an opportunity to lease the space next door. It would double our square footage. I'm thinking of adding a home goods line, maybe even skincare. It's the next logical step. I listened, my expression unreadable, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But, she continued, her smile unwavering, the bank wants a co-signer. It's just a formality, really. 70,000. You know how these things work better than anyone. She said it as if it were a compliment, as if my financial acumen was a resource she was entitled to. It would mean so much. I looked at her then, at the familiar dance of her request, the carefully chosen words, the confident expectation. I could already hear the silence that would follow if I said yes, the absence of gratitude, the slow, creeping amnesia that would erase my contribution. I can't do that, Iris, I said, my voice even and calm. She blinked, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Why not? It's not like you're stretched thin. What do you even do all day? Just then, Caden walked into the kitchen, freezing near the sink as he took in the sudden tension in the room. He didn't say a word, just picked up a dish towel and began to dry a glass that was already spotless. I turned to face my daughter-in-law fully. I spend my days exactly as I choose to, I said, my voice still quiet but firm. And I'm not co-signing. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She shot a desperate look at Caden, but he remained focused on his task, his back to us both. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I offered a faint, sad smile and walked past them, out of the kitchen and toward the front door. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just an answer that didn't need to be repeated. As I stepped outside, the setting sun warmed my back. I walked through the front gate without a backward glance, without saying goodbye, and went home to unlock the drawer. The key was in its usual place, hidden inside an old sewing tin that had belonged to my mother, tucked behind a row of old ledger books. I had half expected my hands to tremble, but they were perfectly steady. I slid the bottom drawer open, the metal runners groaning under the weight of a decade of silent sacrifices. The folder was thick now, a tangible history of receipts, wire transfers, and notarized statements. Every page bore a name, sometimes mine, sometimes theirs, but every single number represented a piece of me I had given away. Near the back of the folder was a contract from 2017. I remembered that time with a painful clarity. Iris had been on the verge of panic. The boutique was failing, rent was overdue, and a supplier was threatening to sue. The phone call had been late at night, her voice ragged with a desperation she was trying to conceal. Caden had already used up their meager savings. The bank had turned them down. I was her last resort. I met her at a sterile diner off the highway, the kind of place where difficult conversations happen over lukewarm coffee. I had the contract with me, already printed and reviewed by a lawyer friend. I wasn't being cruel. I was being careful. If I was going to risk $60,000 of my retirement, I needed some security. She barely skimmed the document, her eyes darting over the legal language, her mind clearly elsewhere. She signed where I indicated, her signature a rushed, jagged line. Then she slid the papers back across the table and let out a long, shuddering breath, like someone who had just been pulled from the water. I filed the contract away the next day and never mentioned it again. Until now, the clause was clear, unambiguous. In exchange for a financial bailout of $60,000, Lenor H. Holstead would assume 52% ownership of the Gilded Fern, effective immediately. It was legal, notarized, and quietly, indisputably binding. She must have assumed I'd forgotten, or that I would never have the courage to use it. For a long time she was right. I had convinced myself that my silence was keeping the peace, that letting them live in their comfortable fiction was what held our family together. But peace cannot be built on a foundation of denial. I slipped the contract into a fresh envelope. Tomorrow, it would no longer be a secret hidden in a drawer. Tomorrow, it would be a memory she could no longer afford to forget. I knew the moment I walked away from that dinner table that something had fundamentally changed. It wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion, but a quiet, internal shift, like the first crack in a sheet of ice. My simple two-word answer, "I'm not," had landed with the force of a judgment, and I had left before the pieces could shatter. The following 3 days were a study in silence. A heavy, expectant quiet that was a stark contrast to the constant, low-level hum of their needs that had become the background music of my life. Then, on the 4th day, there was a knock at my door. It was Iris, her body rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. Caden stood a step behind her, looking weary, his eyes pleading for a resolution before the conversation had even begun. I opened the door wide, a silent invitation into my home. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, not out of a sense of hospitality, but from a need to anchor myself in the familiar, the ordinary. "We're not here for tea," Iris snapped, brushing past me into the living room she had so often graced, but never truly seen. Caden followed, his steps heavy with reluctance. I walked over to the sideboard where I had left the envelope. It wasn't thick, but it was dense with the weight of years. I handed it to Caden. He took it with a look of confusion, then opened the flap and began to read. I watched his face as his eyes moved across the pages, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. I saw the color drain from his cheeks as he sifted through the evidence of my silent support, the wire transfers, the tuition receipts, and finally, the notarized contract from 2017. "Iris," he said, his voice tight with a dawning horror. "Did you sign this?" She barely glanced at the paper in his hand. "It's exaggerated," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's twisting things. That was years ago." "It's your signature," he countered, his voice flat. "And these numbers—" "Mom, these are real." Iris crossed her arms again, her gaze as cold as ice. "She's using this to control us. That's all this is." I sat down in the armchair across from them, the familiar chintz a small comfort. "No," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'm using it to stop being erased." For the first time, Caden looked at me. I mean, he truly looked at me, his eyes filled with a slow, dawning recognition, like someone realizing they've been shouting in an empty room. Iris, however, refused to meet my gaze. I hadn't expected an apology and I didn't ask for one. I knew it would never come. But I had given them the folder. I had dragged everything out of the shadows and into the light. What they chose to do with the truth was no longer my burden to carry. The silence that had settled between us cracked 2 days later, not with a quiet knock, but with the insistent, angry buzz of the doorbell being held down. I opened the door to find Iris already speaking, her words a torrent of accusation. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her face a mask of fury. "You're a parasite, clinging to something you never built." I stood my ground, my expression calm. I did not flinch. Caden was behind her again, his face etched with exhaustion. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "can we please just talk? This isn't worth destroying the family over." I waited, letting his words hang in the air. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous, fretful gesture. "Just sell your shares," he pleaded. "We'll buy you out. You can walk away from this, and we can put all this tension behind us." I looked from my son's weary face to my daughter-in-law's defiant one. "I didn't ask for ownership, Caden," I said, my voice even. "I never sought control. I stepped in when you had nowhere else to turn. I co-signed, I funded, I rescued, and then I stepped back and let you both take all the credit." Iris opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, a gesture that was both a plea for silence and a command. "I wasn't clinging," I continued. "I was holding things together because I thought it mattered. Now that it seems it doesn't, I am simply refusing to disappear." Caden shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the floor. Iris just stared at me, her eyes hard, as if she could will me into feeling guilty. "I'm not selling my stake," I said, the words clear and final. "I am not going to erase my part in this story just to make you more comfortable." Neither of them spoke. The silence that filled the space between us was different this time. It wasn't awkward or tense. It was final. A door closing. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away, their retreating figures a portrait of defeat. I closed the door gently, the soft click of the latch echoing in the sudden stillness of my home. I had told them I wouldn't be erased. Now I had to show them what that meant. I decided to go to their house the next afternoon. I wasn't going to argue or to plead. I was simply going to be clear. I brought the folder with me again, tucked under my arm like an old familiar friend. Iris opened the door, a stiff, brittle smile plastered on her face that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. Caden was already in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. No one offered me a cup of tea this time. I placed the documents on the coffee table between us, a quiet offering of truth. "These are not threats," I said, my voice low and steady. "They are records. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just want to make sure you understand what has already been agreed to." Caden began to flip through the pages, his movements slower this time, as if he were trying to absorb the weight of each transaction. Iris remained standing by the doorway, her arms crossed, a silent, defiant statue. "So, you want to be the hero now?" she asked, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "Is that it? You want us to bow down and thank you?" "No," I replied, meeting her gaze without wavering. "I want to close the account." She let out a short, harsh laugh. "You're not a hero. You're just a bitter old woman who needs to feel important." My voice remained even, devoid of the anger that was churning inside me. "I was the accountant," I said simply. "And now, the account is closed." Caden looked up from the papers, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said, letting my words sink in, "that whatever you build from this day forward, however you manage to keep the boutique open or don't, is entirely yours to carry. I will not fund it, I will not fix it, and I will not answer for it anymore." No one tried to stop me as I stood up. I picked up my original folder, leaving the copies on their coffee table, a silent testament to the past, and walked out the door. The silence that followed me was heavier this time, freighted with the weight of unspoken truths and the consequences of choices made long ago. 2 mornings later, a thick, official-looking envelope arrived through my mail slot. I knew what it was before I even opened it. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was clear: coercion, undue influence, a claim that I had manipulated a vulnerable Iris into signing the ownership contract while she was under extreme financial and emotional distress. They were demanding that I return the shares, that my name be wiped clean from their business, that I simply disappear. That evening, I called my friend Blythe. She listened to the whole story without interruption, and when I was finished, she gave me a name, Margot Delaney. A retired litigator, Blythe had said, but still as sharp as a tack. Margot was all of that and more. She read the contract, reviewed the bank statements, and even unearthed old email threads between me and the boutique's landlord and suppliers. When she was done, she gave a single, decisive nod, the kind that spoke of a confidence born from years of experience. "This is a bluff," she said, her voice crisp and no nonsense. "We'll end this cleanly," and we did. The court hearing was over in less than 20 minutes. Their lawyer made a passionate, if unsubstantiated, argument. Margot, in her calm, methodical way, presented the facts, the dates, the figures, the signed forms, the timestamps on the wire transfers, the ownership agreement that had saved their business from certain collapse. The judge, a woman with kind, tired eyes and a mane of silver hair, looked over the mountain of evidence, then looked directly at Iris. "The evidence presented is unshakable," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The motion to dismiss is granted." The sharp crack of the gavel seemed to make Iris flinch. She left the courtroom on Caden's arm, her face pale, her steps unsteady. Neither of them looked at me. Outside, in the bright California sun, Margot turned to me with that same reassuring nod. "It's over," she said simply. "They can't touch your shares again." I nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. I didn't feel victorious. There was no triumph, no sense of vindication. Just a profound, bone-deep weariness, the kind that comes only after years of silence finally give way to the truth. The quiet that followed wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the days after the dinner. It was a different kind of quiet, one that crept in slowly, like morning fog, and settled over my life. The text messages from Caden, once a steady stream of requests and reminders, dwindled to nothing. The phone calls from Iris, always a prelude to a new financial crisis, ceased altogether. At first, I thought the silence would be painful, a constant reminder of the family I had lost. But instead, it felt like space. Like a room that had been cluttered for years had finally been cleared out, leaving room to breathe. Without the steady infusion of my funds, the polished veneer of the boutique began to chip and fade. I heard through the grapevine, a friend of Blythe's who knew someone who worked nearby, that Iris had been forced to downsize her inventory and let 2 of her employees go. There were whispers of late rent payments and suppliers who were now demanding cash up front. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, no sense of vengeful glee. I didn't hope for their failure, but I also didn't ride to the rescue. My days as their safety net were over. I had spent so much of my life being useful to them that I had forgotten what it felt like to be still. To simply be. My mornings, once consumed with their problems, now began with the feel of cool earth under my fingernails and the soft, rustling sound of leaves in the early morning sun. I learned how to divide dahlia bulbs and harvested rosemary from my garden, which I gave to my neighbor Pauline, who baked it into the most delicious bread for her little cafe. I started painting again. My first few canvases were a disaster, but slowly, tentatively, I began to find my way. I would lose hours in the simple act of mixing colors, of trying to capture the light as it fell across a vase of flowers. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't experienced in decades. I started volunteering at a local financial literacy clinic. I helped people who had never balanced a checkbook, widows who were struggling to navigate the confusing world of online bill pay, and college students who were trying to build good credit from the start. No one there ever sneered at my advice or questioned my usefulness. It was a strange and wonderful feeling to be so deeply seen, so appreciated, by people who asked for nothing more than what I was willing to give. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Caden. "Mom, we miss you." Just those 4 words. No punctuation. No explanation. I read it once, then again. It didn't say, "I'm sorry." It didn't say, "I understand now." It just said, "We miss you." As if my absence was the only thing that had gone wrong. As if the distance between us was the cause of the crack in our family, and not the years of dismissal and disrespect that had preceded it. I didn't reply. I didn't type out a dozen angry responses only to delete them. I didn't sit with the familiar ache in my chest, hoping it would fade. I simply deleted the message and turned my phone face down on the table. The kettle was whistling on the stove, signaling that the water was ready for my evening tea. A half-finished canvas, a riot of blues and greens, waited for me in the sunroom. The garden hose was still coiled by the peonies, whose petals were just beginning to curl at the edges, a sure sign they were thirsty. So I filled my watering can and stepped back out into the cool evening air. The life they had tried to confine me to, the small, useless life they had defined for me, was never really mine. This one, this quiet, simple, beautiful life was. And it was blooming, finally, without anyone's permission but my own. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen or had to reclaim your own space, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your wisdom mean the world to me. And please, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you turn on your notifications, you'll be the first to know when the next story is ready to be shared.